Okay, so after you have wedged your clay, you want to pat your clay into a sphere, because as the wheel is spinning, you want to make it as easy on yourself as possible. If it's in an abnormal or non-spherical shape or form, you will have your hands be bumping, and you will knock your piece of clay off center. So we are demonstrating centering right now. So pat your piece of clay into a sphere. And when you throw your clay down, you want your wheel head to be relatively dry. It's also good to just have your towel right here. And you want to toss it down there so that it thuds, it makes a noise, and it is sticking to the wheel head. The other thing that will help you initially is to pay attention to these concentric circles that are on your wheel head. You can tell right away if your mass of clay is off center, because if it's not equally distanced between the first concentric circle that you see, it's going to be off center. So you want to scoot it just with your hand towards the center as much as possible. Now you want to get some water. You need your hands to be firm, and you need to have water between your hands and between the clay. Otherwise, your hands will stick to the surface and create friction, which will slow everything down and keep it off center. You want to go fairly fast, but not full speed, okay? This is full speed. If you go full speed, it will just keep knocking it off center. So you want to go fast, not full speed. I prefer to hold my sponge in my hands, but that's a preference. If you prefer to squeeze some water out and just use your hands, that's fine also. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be using even pressure. You'll see that my arms are locked on my legs here. You may also use the splash pan as a way to anchor yourself. That stabilizes you. You need to be stable in order to manipulate the clay so that it is in the center of the wheel. If your arms are like this, they are not going to be locked in, and they will keep moving with the clay. So now I'm applying pressure from the top. And as I do that, I have my right arm locked in so that it does not move. So as I push the clay down, it's filling this space that I am creating with my hands. I'm going to do what's called coning up, and that is where we gather clay from down at the bottom and then transfer that pressure into the palms of my hands and move your hands up to the very top. And again, press down and into the other hand. So my hands are stronger when my fingers are bent, and that's why I use my sponge, because by virtue of holding my sponge, my hand is stronger and able to control the outside contour of that mass of clay. So here I am coning up again. If you're too aggressive in the coning up, where you apply too much pressure and you lift too quickly, you will just end up with a mass of clay in your hands and the rest of it stuck to the wheel head. So there is an adjustment period, because it is a fairly forceful technique. If you end up with a little bit of clay scraped off in your hands, that's fine. What you don't want to do is just be scraping off a lot of material to be able to get it centered. You want to be using your hands and that space that your hands are creating for that clay to get it centered and in a dome shape. You also want to have a very clear distinction from the wheel head and where the clay comes down to meet it. What you don't want to have is what I call a pad of clay down there at the bottom, okay? Because A, that's material that you're not going to use, that you should be using when you're creating your pieces. And also, if this is off center at all, and it is more than likely to be off center because you're not controlling that with the strongest part of your hands, this will consistently knock your hands and move your hands and knock you off center. So I do end up removing clay when I have to do that, because there's no way to really capture that without removing some clay. So The key takeaways are to start with a round sphere, to throw it hard into the center of the wheel as best you can, to use the concentric circles of the wheel to see if you were evenly spaced, then apply the pressure with your hands. All of those steps, those preliminary steps, will help you to center your clay. Also, use soft clay. If there is a hand building class going on at the same time as the wheel throwing class, the clay consistencies will end up being different. And if you have hard clay, it's just going to be much more difficult to center. So all the way down to that wheel head. Okay? When I start to come down, I really start to work on the right-hand side of the wheel. I am right-handed. You'll notice that the wheel is spinning counterclockwise. That is appropriate because once I start to open, I am going to be working at about 4 o'clock. And the way that the wheel head is spinning will not be counterproductive to my pulls. If I am working on this side of the clay and the wheel is spinning into my fingers can get twisted and then ruin the vessel. Okay, so opening a bowl. When you're creating a bowl, you need to have a certain amount of clay underneath where the bottom curve will be. So what I'm talking about here is when you're throwing a bowl like this, you don't actually throw this contour. You actually trim this away after it's gotten stiff enough for you to be able to flip it over and apply a tool to it to remove this clay. When you're throwing it, the clay would be too soft. So what you have to do is you have to have a pad of clay that supports that right there. So when you begin to open, make sure you're centered. If you're not centered now, your piece never will be. You will always have one side that's higher than the other. You'll always have one side that's thicker or thinner than the other. To create a consistently even-walled piece, you have to not only make sure it's centered before you start, you have to keep it centered along the way. So to create my initial hole, I keep my hands wrapped around the clay mass, and I start to send my thumb down. Now, because of the trimming process, you're removing clay not only from this area here, but underneath here also. And you want to give yourself options in terms of foot style. So you want to leave yourself about 3/4 of an inch of clay down here at the bottom. And it's hard to judge that when you're first learning how to throw because it is a feeling, a sensory experience. But what you can do is open your clay up wide enough so that you can use your pin tool, get all the water out of the inside, use your pin tool, send it all the way down to the wheel head, insert your finger down to the floor of the pot, keep it there and pull it out. That tells me how thick my bottom is. So it's a little over 3/4 of an inch, but not quite an inch down there. As I am doing my pulls, I will probably thin out the bottom a little bit more. So that's a good amount of clay underneath there for me to go ahead and start. So initially you saw me put my hole down there. My hands were wrapped around the outside. Now I am going to begin to use my left hand on the interior and my right hand on the exterior to start pulling a wall. Okay? If you've ever done wheel throwing before, there are many different ways that you can effectively pull a wall. But the thing that you have to remember is that you're most effective and most efficient when you use small surface area. You don't have to apply as much force and pressure inward to your other fingers if you're using a small bit of surface area. If you are throwing like this and you're using a large amount of surface area, the palm of your hand and all of your fingers, you're going to have to apply a lot of force to be able to actually pull that wall. If you are using small amounts of surface area of your fingers, then you do not have to apply as much pressure. When you're creating a bowl, you basically just want to do that pull. You start in the center and you pull up and out at the same time. You can see that on the outside, the bowl looks like a cylinder. On the inside, it's beginning to take that rounded interior shape. Again, always starting from the center and applying a little bit of pressure every time. And what happens, I start with my fingers out like this. As I come into the wall, they turn just a bit so that I have that small surface area, and I throw the outside is usually kind of around my knuckle, is that outside contact point. Also notice that my hands are constantly in contact with each other. What I mean by that is that I'm not throwing like this with my hands separate, right? You lose a lot of control. You lose a lot of support, okay? So they're together. They're not like looped or locked or anything like that. They're just working with one another. So again, starting from the center, and my other finger is way down here at the bottom. I never start my pull until I know that I'm centered both on the inside and the outside. So again, it's a looking and a feeling thing. I can still use my concentric circles down here to make sure that my clay, my mass, is centered. You want to go slow and repeat the same action. That's how you have the most control over the form that you're throwing. You do not want to keep a puddle of water inside your vessel. You want to keep it pretty clean. And every single time that you do a pull, you want to come up and over that top edge. That helps to keep the entire form centered and level. So I'm slowing down my pressure. I'm not applying as much pressure as I come to this rim. And I'm just using my fingers, my thumb, and my other fingers are coming up and over that edge to make sure that I keep it level that way. It's also important to take note of these lines on the inside here. These are called throwing lines. And what that's indicative of is how consistently I'm pulling up, and also the frequency. So if they're tight together, if they're close together, then you're moving up the wall at an appropriate speed. If they are really far apart, then you're moving up the wall too quickly and you're not providing the wheel, the spinning of the wheel, to do its work as that soft clay is in between your fingers. So this is about as much as I can pull this wall here. At this point, you can start to use things like your metal rib and some of your other tools to help do some refining work. So this can also help to shape. So I had something that was, it was round, but I can take this tool now and clean up the outside and make it a lot rounder, right? Because this can support that shape as I'm pushing from the inside. Now, as you do your inspiration PowerPoints, you'll see that there are many different kinds and shapes and varieties of bowls. This is kind of just a very standard shape. So I want you to explore pushing and pulling, utilizing some of your tools to make different shapes and different marks. If you try something and you're thinking, well, I kind of like that, but I want to try something different, take some of your tools and just start to explore and play with them. So right now, I'm simply making a different shape of the contour, by allowing the tool, I'm pressing the tool on the outside and my fingers on the inside are open so that the clay can move in that space. When you're using your metal rib or your wooden rib, you always want to be holding this tool at about a 45 degree to the surface of the clay. If you hold it at a 90, you will probably end up cutting into the side of the wall and then you won't have a bowl anymore anyway. So you want to be holding it at about a 45. Notice that I'm holding it and using my hands in the same way as if I were throwing the vessel. Right? They're either touching each other or touching the tool in some kind of way. So remember that this clay down here is going to be trimmed away when the piece gets leather hard, stiffens up a bit. And we can flip it and turn it on its rim. Okay? One last thing you want to do before you take your vessel off is to go ahead and give yourself ample space to get your fingers underneath there and get your bowl off of the wheel head. Okay, so carve yourself a nice big undercut with your wooden knife here. Okay, so I hold it like this and carve away that clay underneath. That's going to go away anyhow when you go to trim. I forgot my wire tool. Thanks. Okay, so take your wire tool, and you don't want it to be loose. You need it to be as tight and strong as you can. Think about like when you're flossing your teeth, right? You got to get a nice tight fit. Anyway, take your wire tool and just go right underneath that bowl. Don't let it sit for very long. Come down here and just pull up one side. Yes, you are going to misshape your bowl, but when you put it back down, you can shape it again so that it's round. And you have to be gentle when you put it back down. If you flop it or let go too quickly, you will definitely have a misshapen bowl. All right, so I'm going to do another one without talking as much. Now you'll notice that when I started and my wheel head was totally clean, it was dry. At this point, I'm going to use this clay that exists here and just have the next sphere stick to that. That's fine. What you don't want to do is take your sponge and wet the entire thing down, because then your clay will not stick. Okay, so this is really off center, right? If I went to go ahead and start centering this right now, I've got a lot of work ahead of me. Take the opportunity to do those preliminary steps to get it closer to the center of the wheel before you start. So this is much better. Ideally, when you're centering, it should take about 30 seconds to a minute of your time. I'm working with about 3 pounds of clay right now, which can make a fairly large bowl. You can use anywhere from 2 to 3 pounds to start. If you feel like you're having trouble centering 3 pounds of clay, go ahead and move back down to 2 and work your way back up. So centering is the fastest. As soon as you open up that hole and you start pulling up those walls, you have to slow down. And from here on out, almost with every pull and everything that I do, I'm constantly slowing the wheel down. Centrifugal force will have its way with the clay if you don't slow the wheel down. As the clay walls get thinner, they get more vulnerable to that centrifugal force, and they will shape themselves, and probably not in any way that you want them to. You will end up with more of like a plate or a wide open bowl than anything that you actually controlled yourself. For those of you who've not thrown before, you should be doing 3, 4, 5 pulls to kind of get to this. For those of you who have thrown on the wheel before, it might not take you as many. But it's better to take more steps than fewer steps to get the shape that you want, because you will have more control. Any questions? Okay. You always want to end up using your metal or your wooden rib to clean off that surface and take away that extra, we call it slurry, but that wet clay that's on the surface. That will help you be able to pick up your vessel. It gives you, basically it gives it, it creates like a stick to it between your dry hands, and this is dry. This is what I mean by dry. They don't have to be totally dry, but they cannot be covered in clay. And that goes for when you're throwing also. If your hands are really covered in clay, there becomes a disconnect between what you're feeling on your fingertips and what's happening with the vessel. So again, make yourself a nice undercut. And it's okay if you mar the bottom of your vessel, because it's clay that you will then trim away anyway. Take your wire tool, go ahead and pull under. I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, you know, this could use a little bit of extra something. So I'm gonna, again, take the opportunity to play. Give this some surface decoration now, so that when I go to glaze later, it helps me make decisions. It's not a totally blank canvas. So take that wire tool, wrap it around your fingers, make it nice and tight, pull underneath. Don't take too much time. Like, don't, you know, use your wire tool and then decide, oh, now's a good time for me to go to the sink and clean something up, and then come back and try and get it off. So again, totally misshapen. But when I go to put it down, I can make it go back the way that it was with some very gentle pushing. And you can also use the various stages of drying to get it back to its, oops, to its round state. Okay. This is how I get that clay off, and then provide a perfect surface for my next sphere of clay to be thrown down and stick well. The end.